Welcome to the land of 10,000 claims. Today on episode 3, Scott, Mike, and I will be talking about why we wouldn't want to be miners. Specifically, we'll be talking about the Milford Mine Disaster. Some of the descriptions that you'll hear about the disaster can be a little bit graphic, so keep that in mind while listening. Thank you for joining us here in the land of 10,000 claims. Welcome to Land of 10,000 Claims. I'm your host, Eric Schwab. I'm here, as always, with my co-hosts Mike Johnson and Scott Ferris. Today, we're debuting a new segment that we want to do going forward. We call it, I Wouldn't Want to Be a Blank. And in this week, we're going to be talking about how we wouldn't want to be miners. Now, before we get to some of that, I first want to mention that, the three of us are attorneys. We're going to be talking about legal topics. However, none of this information should be considered legal advice. If you want legal advice, we represent injured workers in the state of Minnesota, and we are all three attorneys at Fields Law, and we can be found at fieldslaw.com. That's Fields Law, FIELDSLAW.com. We're here to help with injured workers in the state of Minnesota. So as lawyers, we all like our jobs, right? You guys are happy? Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the nice aspects of being a lawyer is we really don't run the risk of getting hurt at work. We actually don't have to really go into the workers' compensation on a regular basis.
Paper cuts.
Yeah. But other than that, well, hey, we're like paperless though, aren't we?
Yeah,
Like we don't
true.
really do much. I've had a previous work injury working in retail, and I believe Mike, you've had a previous injury too, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So in other professions, you see injuries much more commonly. Being lawyers, we really don't see too many of them. And that's generally a good thing. You don't want to be in the workers' compensation system because as much as I love it, it's not designed to be friendly to employees. It's designed to be a compromise between employees and employers. So the workers' compensation system is that compromise between employees and employers. And throughout history, it's changed and shifted to respond to issues that have come up. And there were times where being a certain profession was not a very good situation. So we want to talk about miners specifically today, and we want to talk about two historical issues with miners, which include dependency benefits as well as the suicide defense. But before we get into those issues, I think we need to talk and kind of lay the background on what being a Minnesota miner was like and the mining situation itself. So mining in Minnesota really came about in 1865 when Minnesota had its gold rush. I don't know if you guys know that Minnesota actually had a gold rush.
Didn't know about it.
Yeah.
I had zero clue about that.
So like from a historical standpoint, it was kind of a thing back then. Like you got the 49ers, they're called the San Francisco 49ers because San Francisco, 1849. And they found gold out there. It was a good time. Up in northern Minnesota, not so much. They were really disappointed in the gold there. They could find flecks in granite, but it cost more money to get the gold out than it was worth. And there are actually companies still to this day trying to figure out how to get the gold out of there in a more cost-efficient way. No one's figured it out yet, though. But that's kind of a different issue. So you have the gold rush happening in 1865, goes to 1867, and then they pretty much abandon it. You get a little bit of an uptick in 1893 because they found a little bit of gold on Rainy Lake. That's the one that's right up on the border with Canada. But that's about it as far as gold. So these people, they come up, they're really excited. Hey, we're going to strike gold. We're going to be rich. Not so much. What they do find, though, is they find other minerals. And a lot of the things up there, involve iron. Hence why they call it the Iron Range. Don't know. That's the new information?
No.
Yeah.
No, I knew that.
I know. I mean, hopefully,
bring me something new.
I'll do what I can. But I'm hoping someone's listening to this and it just blows their mind. Whoa, it's called the Iron Range because they had iron up there. Whoa. Okay, so the population up there, there's an average of about 5,000 people in kind of the Iron Range area, and that was in 1885. By 1920, we're talking about 100,000 people, so 20 times bigger. And through that expansion, you have some interesting things happening. And this isn't even related to work comp, but I find this pretty interesting, so I'm going to share it. I'm a little bit of a nerd. I've actually taken the Sudan mine tour a couple of times. Highly recommend it.
Not Sudan, the country, though.
No, not Sudan, not the country. No, good
Right.
clarification there.
Yes.
Good catch. No, there's up near Lake Vermilion. There's a mine, and if they're still doing the tours, I would highly recommend it. I think they stopped with COVID, but would recommend it. Anyway, back on topic a little bit. Did you guys know that Hibbing actually moved part of the city so they could mine underneath where they had built up some of the city?
That was new information.
That is also new information to me.
There you go. I'm bringing you the goods. So, anyway, they have these mines that are getting set up all over northern Minnesota, and what they would do is they would harvest whatever minerals and materials. They would then bring it over to Duluth. It would go on Lake Superior, and it would usually end up in Chicago or Detroit for the most part. They just take it through the Great Lakes. So you have this process and this function getting set up, and you have this really risky, terrible job of being a miner, and you have the workers' compensation system coming up at the same time. So the workers' compensation system, I don't know if most people know this, but it's a state-by-state basis. There's no federal workers' compensation for a general employee. There are special exceptions for railroad workers. Sorry.
Train workers, we can call them, if that's a little easier for you.
Okay, train workers. There are rules for train workers. There are rules for longshoremen who work on docks, and there's rules for federal employees. But generally, workers' compensation is a state by state issue. Each state makes its own rules. Each set of rules is different and unique from each other. And as someone that, when I was an adjuster many years ago, I can tell you that states are very different on some of the benefits that they have. So workers' compensation first comes about in Germany in 1884, and it kind of catches on in Europe and then comes over to the United States, and Minnesota passes its first statute in 1913. So from the gold rush in 1865 to 1913, miners really didn't have that much as far as protections or recourse if they were to get hurt at work. Before the workers' compensation system, what would happen is someone would get hurt at work and then they would sue like they would any other case. So they would have to prove negligence, and it kind of backed up the court system. That's one of the biggest reasons we have workers' compensation, is that the court system just got flooded with people getting hurt at work, and the work comp system, that compromise between employee and employer, allowed a lot of things to stay out of court. On a federal level, you really didn't have much for protection either. You have the U.S. Bureau of Mines that was created in 1910. They investigated accidents, things like that. But OSHA doesn't come about until 1970. And a lot of the federal protections don't come in until 1970. The most we get as far as protections besides workers' compensation is in the 1920s, Minnesota passes a law that requires mines to be inspected every 90 days. But the effectiveness of those inspections is I'll say questionable. I think it's a fair way to say that. So the background is we have a very heavy job, a very new form of law to protect these workers. And what you end up seeing is you have very, very violent and difficult cases come up and really test this law, and you have a Supreme Court trying to do its best. So, before we get to those specific cases themselves, how about we get a little bit more on like the day-to-day type of activity for miners? So Scott, tell me day-to-day, what's a miner doing?
Not fun things. Not fun things. So when mining kind of started in Minnesota, the conditions were pretty terrible, depending on who you asked, I suppose. But for the most part, pretty awful. Damp, humid all year, about 50 degrees constantly all year, which doesn't sound too bad when it's middle of January, February, but they also had to be wearing a lot of heavy clothes, heavy bib overalls, hats, and heavy rubber boots. They'd also have that with that hat, the hard hat, they're oftentimes the only source of light, being either a candle on their helmet in the early days. Otherwise, they around 1915 or so, around that time, they came out with carbide lamps, um, but were also kind of susceptible to explosions as well because it was basically a flame kind of a thing, and then eventually light bulbs. But that was really it. That was going down underground hundreds of feet, and your only light was on your hat, and if it went out, well, you're in the dark for a while until you can figure out where you're going.
Well,
Um,
and even when these lights are working, I mean, think about a candle in complete pitch darkness. You're seeing a couple feet in front of you most. And we're not talking about like a candle you have on your coffee table. Like we're talking about a candle that could actually fit on your hat. So not much light is coming through here.
Basically, a birthday candle.
Yeah.
Right.
So the obviously these conditions are not great and are going to make everyone down there susceptible to work injuries. A lot of people died. Hundreds died from lung-related illnesses alone in Minnesota. Cave-ins, electrocutions, explosions, falls. Um, there's just numerous ways that you could be injured in various gruesome ways. But one of the deadliest that we had here in Minnesota was the Milford Mine Disaster in 1924. The Milford Mine opened up in 1917. Pretty standard mine of the time. It was down about 200 feet, and they were mining manganese ore to make steel. They harvested about 70,000 tons of ore a year, and the issue though is that the mine was located right next to a lake known as Foley Lake at the time, and the mining activity was starting to get near the lake over time here. The mine had opened in 1917. We're about 7 years in, and there was concerns about a potential cave in near the lake. Before this disaster happened, um, a few miners actually quit. They didn't think that they didn't know if the mine was going to last another season. They were worried about the issues that this lake was causing in the future. Uh, it, on December 10th, 1923, the mine is inspected, and at the time it was about, what was it, 80 every 90 days that Minnesota was requiring inspections at the time,
Yep. Every 90 days.
and they deemed that it was safe. But then, roughly 2 months later, on February 5th, 1924, got a standard, typical Minnesota cold day. Everything's going normally, and they were getting close to the end of their shift at about 3:30 in the afternoon, and all of a sudden, a portion of the mine caved in under the weight of the bog water that was up above, right near Foley Lake. Not a normal cave in, but it was a flood. A lot of water came in, and it filled within 15 feet of the top of the mine within a few minutes. It's filled with water, muck, a lot of different random animals that were in the lake or around it. There are some miners that were far enough away that they could start running away from the water, trying to try and escape. But when you got water coming in at 500 gallons a minute or more, it fills up pretty quick. When the by the end of the day, when this tragedy kind of wrapped up, there was 48 miners working, and only 7 were able to survive this disaster. Um, it was a really horrific incident in Minnesota history, and there's 41 people that died, or 41 men, and 38 were married, and between them they had roughly 80 kids. So ended up with a lot of single parents out there. It was a pretty sad event. Took them, over a little over a year, roughly, to clean everything out and open the mine back up. 9 months to recover all the human remains. And like I said, the decaying fish and turtles and muskrats and everything else. It was not a pleasant cleanup by any means.
Well, and when you're thinking of these people here, a lot of the people working in the mine were recent immigrants. So they were coming from different parts of Europe. So you had people from, people that were Czech, Norwegian, Swedes. Um, they're recent immigrants, and they have their families up there, and some of them were actually working with their family members. So you had individuals in this accident that died that were 15 years old, like working with their parent. And some of the news articles that came out around this time and described like the specific last moments that people had with some of their loved ones as they were escaping, it's heartbreaking. I mean, there's no real other way to describe it. So it, you're in a completely pitch dark cave. Ice cold black water starts coming in really quickly, and you have to run down a pitch black corridor with essentially nothing guiding you. That's an absolute nightmare. I can't. There aren't too many things that I can think of that would be worse than that.
Space.
Well,
Space terrifies me.
Well, or like sinking on a ship. Like, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of
yeah,
reminds you of like a scene you'd see in Titanic. The guys in the boiler room,
They had
the furnace
no
room, they had
no chance.
no shot. And, they even had electricity. These guys didn't. They just had their helmets to light. And of course, as soon as that gets wet, the candle's extinguished and they've got essentially no light. Not only did you have to get out from being in the bottom of the L of the mine, but you had to then try to get 200 feet up. And chances obviously were not good, and the results bore that out.
But that's where the workers' comp comes in on a lighter note.
yeah.
The Whitmarsh Mining Company was insured for workers' compensation. They had coverage. The workers' compensation statute had only been in existence for about 10 years, 11 years at the time, but they had coverage. The families of the deceased were able to get compensation paid within a week, albeit it was not much. And the problem being that the benefits that were paid are incredibly different than what they are today. And there's some issues with dealing with large scale deaths in work situations like this, and just deaths in general with workers' compensation at the time. And it's still true today that a lot of dependency benefits are not as much as what could be recovered by an individual employee. It's very fact specific, but on a case by case basis. But Mike, do you want to kind of explain what some of those differences are?
Yeah, so I think the starkest example in this particular incident and how different the statute was back then than it is now is if you were a single man with no dependents in this, and you were killed in this accident, nobody got anything. There were no benefits payable. Today, $60,000 would be paid to your estate, and distributed amongst your heirs, whoever those might be. But back then, basically, if you were one of these 15-year-olds who obviously wasn't married and had no children, the company had to pay nothing for the fact that you died in this accident.
Well,
Rate,
and I would say that's really tragic when you start thinking about who's most likely to die in work related accidents. Well, the people that are doing some of the most dangerous jobs are going to be, young people that may not know any better or maybe trying to make as much money as possible doing these dangerous jobs, and then, suddenly they get nothing. Their estate gets nothing just because they don't happen to be married. So it's kind of a double whammy in that way.
and I think in the era, but even continuing, through the 1970s and 80s and through more, even when the mining industry became more regulated and we knew more about diseases like coal miners, lung diseases, and things like that. I think it's always been the reality that mining is a dirty, dangerous job, but one that pays well for people that maybe don't have access to the educational resources that others do. And so you have people in smaller communities where there aren't a lot of economic opportunities. It is a well-paying job that you don't need a lot of education to work. And in that sense, it can be exploitative. Just to talk a little bit about what the rates would have been back then. The minimum benefit back then could have been as little as $8 to $20 per week. So you lost your husband in the mine, and theoretically, all Whitmarsh, the mining company, owed you was $8 a week. Today, those amounts are much higher. Um, Also, dependent benefits for children ended. Um, they
That
continued while the children were in school K through 12, but um, in reality, a lot of those didn't get paid out because the children of working age or even close to working age would have to find alternative employment to support the family now that dad's died. In today's standards, we make sure that kids get their own set of dependency benefits and they're payable through even post secondary education. Um, so that's a phenomenal difference by today's standards that we basically make sure kids can stay kids, get the education they need, despite losing a parent in a work injury. Burial expenses were much lower back then as far as what the statute provided. Now it's up to $15,000. Um, and ultimately, there were caps on benefits back then that aren't applicable today either.
I in looking at these prior dependency benefits and comparing them to the ones we have now, I'd say a lot of them are pretty bad. I mean, when you're talking about $8 to $20 per week, that's $135 to $338 per week in today's dollars. So, lower rates. I think the thing that stood out to me maybe the most was just the burial expenses, because it's either $100 or $150 depending on when the dependency benefits kicked in. Then so you're talking about in today's dollars less than 1,700 up to maybe about 2,500. And what I don't understand is that did funerals get that much more expensive, or were they just that cheap on the expenses?
I think a little bit of both. I mean, certainly getting a burial plot, there was so much more land available. That was not as expensive. And then you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of times back then people didn't go through the embalming process. So that added
Yeah.
significantly. Um, now too, with burial expenses, it should be mentioned that other forms of finality, if you want to call it that, are covered. So if you get cremated instead of a traditional embalming and burial, that's still covered. Um, I've even seen one where um, the insurance company approved a burial at sea type of program. So um, the family really can spend that money however they wish up to that cap to say goodbye to their loved one.
So we have these dependent benefits that come up because we have the tragedy. And in a tragedy situation like Milford was, the benefits are going to be paid. They're really not going to be disputed. And the tragedy in that is not only do you lose a loved one, but you're also limited in the dependency benefits you get. But that was probably the better outcome than some of the cases we're going to talk about now, because they didn't have a defense. They didn't try to fight you for those benefits. The employer and the insurer said yes, there was an accident. They paid benefits, and everything was fine. The problem is the employer insurer could raise certain defenses in order to get around paying potential benefits. And one of them that was raised a number of times for early miners was the suicide defense. And that changed a little bit over time. But Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about the suicide defense?
Yeah, so we'll talk about how it got started. I think what's important to realize is that current Minnesota law is that you can't recover from an intentionally inflicted injury, whether you kill yourself or not. Um, if you intentionally inflict the injury, then you're not covered by workers' compensation, and the insurance company is not going to pay your benefits.
However,
My
however, the however I'm going with.
no,
Well, like if you have a mental condition that causes you to kill yourself
right.
in current law.
That if it's a mental condition triggered by a work injury, a compensable work injury, and suicide or results from that, um, even an unintentional suicide, we've run into that with like painkiller cases, where someone accidentally overdoses. Um, those situations would be covered. Few and far between, though. And what makes the suicide issue so interesting or complex is that a lot of people, if they're going to commit suicide and try to get work comp benefits from, aren't going to declare their intention to commit suicide at work. Obviously, that would hinder their ability to recover. What in this context of mining, what started happening is that there would now with incidents like Milford, where it was clearly a mine collapse, there was nobody down there was committing suicide, they were trapped, is where there were kind of more of these one-offs where an employee would be off on his own, situation would be unwitnessed, and there was oftentimes an explosion involved because these guys were working with rudimentary dynamite, blasting caps that were often difficult to apply correctly. Dynamite is inherently unstable. Again, you were talking about dark work environments. You think when you're working with explosives, you want the best light possible. And you really have to imagine that these guys a lot of them found that it was easier to get a blasting cap on by biting it onto the dynamite than using a knife or an axe or some other piece of equipment. That just shows you how rudimentary this was. And also, a lot of times they were responsible for their own dynamite. I mean, even that idea in today's society that an employee would be responsible for bringing on any of their own equipment, but particularly explosives.
So
It's just kind of mind-boggling.
could we just repeat that fact again? They wouldn't use their hands. They would bite the explosive in order to get it to work because their hands were too calloused.
And
Like,
if you do that a little too hard, you imagine what would happen.
thank you for listening to us here at the Land of 10,000 Claims. This is the end of part 1 of our discussion about why we wouldn't want to be miners. But join us next time where we continue the discussion and we talk about the suicide defense. I'd also appreciate if you could hit that like and subscribe button. Thanks.